Hello everyone, my name is Mike Edwards. I'll be your instructor this semester. I'm glad to have you along for the current edition of the Marketing 3770 Introduction to Transportation. I think you'll find it to be quite interesting. All the times that we've taught it, the students come away with a much better appreciation for the role of transportation in business as a career opportunity, and as a input into the supply chain management activities. So we're going to get ready for and go on our journey right now. So here we go. Okay, the first thing about that we're going to talk about supply chain management and how transportation fits into it. So we're going to talk about what it is, and basically what supply chain management is it is procurement, the procurement activity plus the demand forecasting activity and the logistics activity. And those are the three major things that constitute supply chain management from an activity standpoint. Now, that's not to say that there's not other things that go on. Transportation belongs in the logistics activity function. I think it's important to understand that we're not talking about departments here. We're not talking about organizations. We're talking about process. So sometimes these activities we talk about may be in other parts of the company, depending upon the culture of the company. But there still can be a supply chain management process if the right leadership exists to make it happen. And that could be you in the future. So hopefully we'll see how that goes, and we'll see where this discussion takes us from there. So let's talk a little bit about supply chain management. Supply chain management itself has evolved really in three phases. The genesis of supply chain management, however, came out of World War II. During World War II, there were situations where the Army was moving faster than the material was available for them to use. So the most poignant example of that was during the Battle of the Bulge, when Patton's Third Army ran out of gas, ran out of fuel before it could cross into Germany, which would have been the first army to cross into Germany, and who knows what that would have evolved into at the end of the war, had the U.S. Had the Western Allies been the first ones to enter Germany instead of the Soviet Union. But that's all history now. But nonetheless, the idea of having the right product at the right place and the right time from a strategic standpoint did come from World War II. So in the 60s, we evolved into something called physical distribution, and that basically was around transportation and warehousing. And then in the 80s, we transitioned or morphed, evolved into something called business logistics. And then in the 90s, we morphed into supply chain management. So just to give you another baseline here, in the 60s, the organization that was formed around physical distribution was called the National Council of Physical Distribution Management, NCPDM. The same organization then evolved into the Council for Logistics Management, or CLM, and it has now evolved into the Council for Supply Chain Management Professionals, CSCMP, a name that you will hear several times and see some of the research will be cited as we go through this semester. Is this it? Is CSCMP the end of the road for this? That everything we've now figured all this out? And the answer, of course, is no. Don't be surprised. You see here we went 20 years between this. We went 10 years between this. My guess is in the next 5 years or so, which would be another 20 years, 28 years now, actually, if you think about it. This actually didn't occur in 1990, but closer to the end of that. But we'll have a 20-year span here where we've been talking about supply chain management. We're still talking about the same things in many ways that we talked about back here, because companies have not adopted or well understood what this is all about. It's still perceived as being quite tactical for the most part, and not as strategic as it really has become. But I think in the next 5 years or so, 5 to 10 years, you'll see this evolve again into supply networks and remove the chain, because the chain implies more of an internal, centralized, linear management strategy, when in fact what we have now is a network, and the network is based on collaboration. It's based on the fact that most of our products, the products that are in global trade, don't come necessarily from within the company. So you're managing multiple suppliers, whether they're domestic or international. Not the point. The point is that you have to have a collaborative relationship with everyone in your supply chain, wherever they may be, and that means a digital relationship. And so that is the direction it's going. And so I think that you'll see, I think that something along those lines will probably happen. Okay, so here's the way it kind of started out for me. Is kind of, this is sort of in some ways kind of a, this is a fishbone drawing, obviously. And when I started out, we were doing this, and these were, for the prime, these are the functions that we did then, that would have reported to me. And then in the materials management sector, we didn't have much of that. Then we evolved into logistics, and we kept this, or I kept all this, and I picked up demand forecasting, picked up net requirements planning, and picked up some bigger roles in some of the more traditional plant handled things, particularly around packaging, because the product line we had was subject to packaging failures, which resulted in product being compromised. And so we needed to deal with that, because this was sterile product. This is medical device product. And if the product itself, if the package was fractured or punctured or anything, it would come back. So the plant never really saw that, and so it was necessary for the logistics group to get involved and come up with some solutions to that, which we did. And we'll introduce you, in some ways, we'll introduce you some of those tools that we did that with. And then here, this is how part of my later experience evolved, because of just the fact that I was with smaller firms. And so I was able to do more and more of this. I was able to do some of these kinds of things, of course, in bigger firms, but this is where it really kind of came together, is when you did it in smaller firms. Now, all along here, these activities were the biggest functions of information technology. So we had more, we were more resource intensive in IT than really any of the other ones were, and that is still the case today, even as we better understand the customer and segment the customer and look at all the data, because of the customer service and order entry. So this is where the data comes from. This data here then, of course, drives this data here to some extent. And then you have to match that up with what marketing and sales, and then what finance wants. So you have all these activities competing and trading off against one another in supply chain management. So we started off with physical flows. Then we have, as I mentioned, the IT side, which is the information side, and then the finance that supports the information. So once you have information, you have a responsibility to record a financial transaction, whether it's an accrual or a sale or an asset or whatever it is. That's up to finance, but basically the visibility into what's moving where and who owns what comes out of the supply chain. We'll talk more about that. So here we are looking at supply chain management, a definition. This just restates what I said before, that for the most part, products are the cumulative effort of multiple organizations, and that makes up the supply chain or the supply network. So I'll have a hard time doing that. I'll use them interchangeably. The fact is that most of global trade, as you hear global trade today, most of the trade deficits and you hear about that kind of thing, most of that is not finished product. It's parts, it's intermediate goods, it's parts and assemblies. 75% of the global trade today on a worldwide basis is what we call intermediate goods, not finished goods. So it's parts coming to another place to be assembled. That assembly may move back, it may move back again. So you're constantly in motion here, and to know how to move that and how what it takes to do that is where you get a lot of this trade that takes place. Supply chain management is, of course, the activity management of the activity, which we're going to look at in just a second, and then the fact that the departments and the organizations that make up that supply chain are all linked together. They're linked together through the physical side, the financial side, and the information side. So let's take a look at the slide that kind of gives you a sense of that. So this is what I'm talking about. It starts with a forecast. That forecast is affected by the market demands, which can be historical. It can be using predictive tools or prescriptive tools. And then also what's happening externally. And what's happening externally could be a competitive issue. It could be a supplier issue. It could be a transportation issue where your carriers have gone bankrupt. It also can be things like we don't have the capacity. Our supplier doesn't have the capacity. We can't introduce this model. We don't have enough whatever, or we have too much. And we need to keep the factories running. To keep the factories running, we have to make things that we don't want to make. So all these kind of come together in this whole idea. And from here, once you come up with a plan that everybody agrees on, which is marketing and sales and finance and supply chain and manufacturing, then those requirements filter down into here. And then this is where everything else takes place. And remember, all of these have their own system. That's my point to you, too. Demand forecasting is generally done can be done within an ERP, but the additional inputs to it are not done in ERP. It's done outside of ERP and then can come back into it. But this is a sales and operations planning input here. And then production planning and raw materials purchasing and packaging and all this. These are all separate types of activities that take place as a result of the demand forecast as you calculate net requirements that you need. And the same with the warehousing side, where the goods have to go, what plants are you going to make it at, where does this product need to be? All this takes place as a result of this demand forecast and the level of forecasting that you go to, which we're not going to talk about here. But all of this then is held together by transportation. So running a model and pressing a button and getting an answer doesn't do anything. Doesn't get product moved. It doesn't make things happen. What moves product from A to B is transportation, and so that makes it probably the most visible aspect of supply chain management and the most costly side of supply chain management that there is. So we don't live in a little bubble anymore. We live in what we call an extended supply chain. And the more extended that supply chain is, the more we get into what we call unstructured and semi-structured data. ERPs work with structured data. They don't work well. They're not meant to work with unstructured data. But the supply chain is unstructured. And so it's extended, and many of the players in here are unstructured. And unstructured means that they're at different levels of technical competency, security, whatever it is. But you need to see all this in order to make sure you're meeting the plan. And this is where the whole idea of partnerships and collaboration enters. That you just can't do this with everyone because not everyone's going to want to do it. And to be able to test this and to maintain this and to know what data is coming in by Wi-Fi and what data is coming in by FTP and what data is coming in by EDI and what data is coming in by whatever other means that are out there, and how many times are people pinging your system and so forth and so on, to monitor all that. This is a true journey. This is a big thing to think about. But this is where we are. This is where we are. We're not in the ERP world. We're outside of that now. And now we're going to bring all this into here. And how are we going to do that? Okay, so we've talked about this, so we don't need to do that again. This is the input into, this is why the accuracy and demand forecast drives finance. So basically what you're looking at is 60, 70, 75% of the company is operating expenses are tied up in supply chain. That gets lost because of the way people are organized. They don't see that demand forecast drives all this activity. Now you may say, well, that's really academic, but I can tell you, depending upon the company you've worked in, it's also very real. And if you present this in the right way, as a business case, you can really make a difference within the organization. The other thing I will tell you is there's a huge talent gap. There's a huge talent gap because as the tools have gotten more sophisticated, the older guys like me, men and women that is, are getting out, and so there's a need for a good blend of leadership skills, strategic thinking, analytics, and quantitative experience. Not that you have to run the models, but you have to know the models are there. And you have to know, you don't have to know how to do linear regression, but you need to know that linear regression is one of the solutions that possibly could come out. And also then be able to explain why that particular solution was chosen over the other 82 that could have been chosen. So these are also part of the challenges we have today, and it's a different kind of a leadership model than in this particular area than companies have experienced in some ways. I think there's been a bigger push to, at least from my ages to make this happen, and from today's managers to make this happen because they realize it and they recognize it, and that's the big thing. So let's look at this. We have jobs coming on in a big way because I don't think globalization is going to cease. It's not going to just shut down. But there's not enough talent out there. There's still this problem of perception that this is not a really widely recognized role within the company, or it's going to have some importance in the company. But that's up to the individuals that are in it. The opportunity to do that is there if you understand what happens and understand the trade-offs and understand the strategic side of this. It is considered to be tactical to a great extent, but in the past decade or so, there's become a far more heightened understanding of risk, particularly cyber risk. And cyber risk is supply chain risk. So understanding the supply chain risk is an area where you can be quite effective. And that means mapping out the supply chain and identifying and prioritizing and calculating what the risk is of a problem with a particular player or partner, and then working with them to make sure that that doesn't happen. So it's again this combination of things we just spoke about that we're going to be looking for, and then as that happens, then more and more companies will start to look at this in the way we've been talking about it academically and theoretically, I guess, for the last 20 years. That supply chain is the business. It is not a department. It is not an organization. It's the business right here. And the concept of risk management is more and more in the boardroom now. So that's a great lever to use. So what's going to happen? Planning, supply chain planning, strategic planning, understanding total cost of ownership, looking at risk assessments, looking at expected sales. We're understanding this whole planning model is critical to the next generation of management. The role of artificial intelligence is something that's new. It's totally new to me, but it's out there now, and it's being used in a lot of different ways. And so you all are going to have to deal with this. We have much better tools than we ever had, and they get us closer to the customer, but it's still not consumer behavior. They get us closer to what's taking place, but there's so many other things that are taking place in that extended supply chain and in the marketplace that a model cannot at all account for all of it. Account for a good part of it and get you to a great starting point. That's what it does. Gives you direction. Okay, it's all digital. Everything we do is digital. Transportation is digital. The supply chain is digital. So we use digital models. We're moving as fast as we can from anything based on paper. And so establishing all that relationships is extremely important. And this just reiterates what we said. there's a disconnect in many cases still. We look at things as cost centers and not as process. Um, and the reality is that you can have all the tools in the world, but they will not change corporate culture. So understanding the culture you're in is critical to where you think you can go. You can take on the culture sometimes, and you can make it. You will make a difference if you do that. It's a hard road to carve in many ways, but it's a road that you should feel comfortable in doing if you're comfortable with the facts that you're bringing to the table. This is why you're seeing this at UMSL. We have the SCM program at UMSL, and we now have an expansive transportation program. So we'll be talking about that a little bit too. So let's talk about logistics. Okay, logistics has a definition, but it's basically some of the more granular activities that take place: outbound transportation management, inbound transportation management. Still very digital, still very strategic, and it's also very tactical in many ways. So it's procurement of third party, but it's the management of all this back into and against the demand plan. So it's a coordination of all that activity that kind of holds all that together, as we spoke about when we looked at that interlocking concept. So here's, from the marketing perspective, it's the place decision. So place is right product, right place, right time. Okay, that's the logistics mantra right there. But since then, we've added other activities to this as well, and that's time, price, quantity, condition, and information. That is, we give the customer what they want the first time, and if you don't do this in the retail world, you get a return. These are the activities. We've kind of spoken about them, so you should know when you talk about logistics, this is what you're talking about. The magnitude of logistics was estimated to be $1.4 trillion in 2016. This is a report issued by CSCMP that talks about the breakdown. It's a great report. It used to be done by Cass Bank here in St. Louis, but it's now done by another entity. So it breaks it down into transportation, inventory, carrying costs, and other costs. This will be one of your reading requirements for this module. But you can see the changes from year over year, and then you can see what we call the compound growth rate. And in most cases, anytime you see what we call CAGR, it's called CAGR. Anytime you see a CAGR in excess of 2.2, which is or 2 to 2.2, which is our rate of GDP, then this would be an area where you want to kind of bring this more in line back to GDP to the best of your ability. And you can do that through a variety of strategies, which we will just lightly touch on in this class and go into in more detail in the companion class to this, which is 3771. So inventory, cost of inventory is affected by the cost of capital. Weighted average cost of capital has been quite low until recently, and even though it's still low, even with the recent increases it's, in the Fed rate, still historically low. So this has an impact on cost of capital. One time we used to use 15% just for the cost of capital. Now we're using numbers dramatically less than that, 3 and 4. So that has a huge impact on the trade-off between inventory and cost, and the cost of carrying inventory. So that brings us to what's happening in that area, which we'll look at in just a second. But if you look at this, this is the percent. This is business logistics costs, those cost elements as a percent of GDP. This is 2007, which is sort of the beginning of the recession, and you can see that we're still in this rate, which of course is why we're still at the 2 points, at the 2 percentage points. The growth is not recovered as it would historically do after a recession, and given all that's going on, the growth is absolutely inhibited by policy uncertainty, currency uncertainty around the world, by risk, by consumer sentiment. So you have to watch this number, but you also have to watch, you also have to watch this number. And this is the inventory, this is the ratio of inventory to sales, because inventory and sales are implicitly tied, because this is all driven by supply and demand. So if the demand for inventory is there, the demand for transportation is there. If the demand for inventory is not there, which is partly a result of better managing inventories, faster turns of inventories, then the demand for transportation also falls, and that's what's happened. That's what's happened in some of these years because we've had overcapacity in the transportation side. As the demand has not recovered, we were running along at this level, and then all of a sudden we went to this level, and we haven't found the norm. When we find the norm, then we'll be in a different place. So rates were quite depressed, and this has impacted carriers dramatically. And as you'll see in just a second here, or as you see in one of the later modules, we talk about economics. Transportation is a key part of the leading indicators for the economy going forward. So even though we've had a rise in energy, we've seen the cost drive. This is the second year in a row, and I think what you're seeing here is the impact. Part of it is the impact of e-commerce. We're seeing smaller consignments, which means a higher cost per pound, but a different kind of a mode. And so we're seeing this as being quite a driver in what's taking place. So this brings us to the last slide here. Again, overcapacity and rate pressures. We have too much capacity for what we're moving. We also have new technology which allows us to do things far more efficiently than we've ever done it before, and that will continue. And we're using new models in terms of new business models in terms of third-party logistics providers, which we'll talk about what they do and how they do it. They're more centers of excellence, if you will. So the companies are outsourcing much of this, and then we're seeing the impact of e-commerce. So let's stop with this one right now, and then we'll come back and we'll talk a little bit about what is transportation.